Working. So thank you for coming this evening, and thank you to Noise Kitchen and Augusta Foundation, blah, 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 for inviting me here to Prague. So I was thinking of how to start trying to talk about what I'm doing, particularly in relation to like Eurorack modules and other synthesizers like this, Dark Interpreter, which I've been kind of producing over the last, I don't know, 4 or 5 years. So I was kind of trying to think of whether to talk like chronologically or to talk about what my interests are, which kind of led me, or what is the background to these modules in a sense. But what I thought I'd do is first of all start talking about what you're hearing right now. So or to describe this kind of process, because somehow this process is quite important for not necessarily understanding what these things are, but what I'm kind of interested in, which is the kind of the material conditions of these technological objects and of myself in relation to these technological objects and to the earth. So what's happening at the moment is that I'm, I guess, breathing, taking air into my lungs. The lungs are then passing the air through the larynx here, which is kind of vibrating at a certain frequency, so probably quite low in this case. So this thing is vibrating, stopping, starting. Then my mouth and nose are forming the words which I'm speaking, or these kind of expressions which are moving through the air, let's say. So it's kind of already this kind of quite complex chain of linked kind of material events, which somehow are not really considered technological. They're more considered as human, but somehow they could be considered as technological as soon as they reach this object here. So this is kind of like the technological, let's say, kind of not necessarily interface, but something like this. So at this point, the vibrations from my voice through the air, and then perhaps, I'm not sure exactly how this microphone is working, but maybe there's some kind of foil plates or something like this. Inside this, one of them is free to move, the other one not free to move. One of them has an electrical charge on it, the other one not. And the changes in vibrational air pressure cause an electrical signal, which then travels down this cable into the mixer here, and then we have this kind of like another technological kind of apparatus, which is kind of quite separate to this one, in some senses physically, and we don't really know what is going on inside this thing. But at some point, this electrical signal, so these changes in movement of electrons goes through this cable, which then comes into this module, which was the first module which I designed and produced, which is called ERD. So what happens with this module is that there's a container. I mean, you also feel free during the presentation to ask any questions, interrupt, whatever. B, I don't know why B, but B, to come closer and see what it is I'm actually talking about. So this is so at this point we have the electrical signal which is coming in here. So there's nothing happening now when I unplug it. Coming out here. And in the meantime it's passing through this square box of earth. Yeah. We can also, there are 2 other earth boxes which we can try in a moment. They're different earths with different properties, which I'm also kind of interested in, and they come from different places. So basically the signal passes through the earth, and then it's amplified and distorted basically just through this earth box. And what we can also do is place another signal here, so that then this is kind of replicating my voice through this. So it's kind of modulating the amplitude of the signal through the earth. Oh, no. So what we'll do is try now a different earth. So how is this earth sounding? So this is a bit more like distorted earth. Or maybe I'm just holding one from like this. But, so this was the second, and I'll talk about the microphone. So with like dispensing with any kind of technological signals or interfaces. So this was the very first module I produced alongside this one here, which is called SIR, which stands for susceptible, infected, and recovered. So this was produced maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and is a control voltage generator, which uses simulations of contagion or plague. So this one here just generates control voltages, which then we can use to, for example, let's just try and modulate the earth signal with this one. Let's see what is happening if I select different. Not a great bit is happening now. Maybe it's not the easiest source to work with. I'm going to try this one. So hello. I don't know what's happening now. What I can do is just to show the earth modulation. I mean the modulation from the SIR module. It should be. So this is just feeding straight into an oscillator or a filter, just to give an idea of how it's working without any, I don't know, not so much in between it. So basically it's just like, I can select two like plague algorithms, and they both kind of inhabit the same space and kind of interfere with each other. And I can change the speed at which this So what's basically happening is they're both kind of not necessarily fighting with each other, but struggling against each other within the same space. And then what you're hearing is this space just like scan through for control voltage at different speeds. So the first 2 modules I was producing was the Earth and this SIR, and then after I produced, I don't know how many of these transparent modules with Earth, I had kind of, how to say, yeah, I was interested in obtaining Earths from different people and from different places which, for me or for somebody else, had some kind of significance, let's say. So I was offering that people could, in return for supplying me with certain kinds of interesting Earth, get like a reduction or a free module. So then somebody contacted me after a period of time, not instantaneously, and various other kind of Earth offers. Somebody from Jerusalem got in contact and said they could supply me with Earth from the site of the crucifixion of Jesus, Golgotha. And around the same time I was working on a piece of writing which was somehow about the writing of Dracula and geology and where it was written, which is in the north of England, and how this kind of, the novel or the story of this vampire and the elimination of the vampire So what I was interested in doing was basically these two modules here, bringing together Earth from Golgotha with the Earth from Whitby in the north of England, which was easy for me to get hold of. So this one is combining like this kind of holy Earth, let's say, with some kind of not so holy in conventional terms of Earth. And then we can see here how this, so I've kept this, do we have any signal at all? What is that? There's no signal. So this is like a very dry Earth in this container, which there should be some kind of signal here. Let's see. So I kind of also kind of maintain the Earth in different degrees of moisture. So I was also kind of interested in this idea that it's somehow it's one of the only modules which you kind of choose how to take care of it, in the sense of like every few months you place it in like a dish of water, it takes up water, and that changes its kind of properties. So it's kind of like, I was interested in this idea of like basically putting Earth, from which a lot of technology is produced, into a kind of circuit, and somehow making this kind of transparent, or not necessarily obvious, but somehow kind of demonstrating how this is kind of equally a part of technology. And this kind of these, I mean, it's like the case of like a lot of these modules, that they're coming out of work that I'm doing in terms of like, as an artist in performance. So I would quite often work with like large piles of earth, circuits which are more kind of open, putting things into the earth, using these kind of globes with circuits on within the earth, putting signals in, taking them out. But one of the kind of, how to say, the not necessarily problems of this, but one of the difficulties is that everything is more or less destroyed during the performance, so it becomes very difficult to tour with this. So this was a way, in some senses, of kind of making something more portable, more reliable, even though in some cases not so reliable, and also not getting rid of the, at the same time being able to put so this could be like one signal, say from here, going into the earth, which I don't have, and then the other signal from here, or like this, just like any signal going through, instead of like, so basically what I've done here is just like, substitute the earth box, or the vampiric holy earth box, with myself. So the signal is passed, the signal from this other module, which I'll talk about later, is then passing through me into the earth is replaced by me, let's say. So that was somehow, I don't know, some kind of introduction to kind of how I started working with like more modular forms of synthesis, or working with Eurorack and producing these modules as somehow a way of like taking what I was doing in other fields, let's say, and somehow like, also it's kind of an interesting process for me of having to like somehow channel or concentrate those ideas into something which is reusable and which other people can work with. And kind of also both modules are quite different in approach. Like one is digital and involved in simulation of, let's say, physical processes of contagion, and the other is involved in kind of material structures or material conditions. But what I'll do now is to go back to, so I was also producing instruments before these modules, so over like the last 10 years or something like this. And one of these, which I have here, which somehow led to this contagion thing, module, the SAR module. So this is the dark interpreter, which is, or was and still is, like produced in 3 different versions. And the idea kind of behind it is that it actually, or more or less, is modeling a medieval village. So inside this technological object is a simulation of the medieval village, which has villagers living in there, and these villagers are subjected also to plague and contagion, which is controlled through these knobs and these touch sensors. So it's kind of like a simulation in code, but I'm able to, using this touch interface, I can somehow place my skin into that code interface, or place the signals of my skin directly into this simulation. So I have some kind of like, how to say, it's like putting my hands into this like technological simulation of a medieval village. Does that make sense? Almost like a puppet or something.
What do you simulate on the village? Like, what do you mean by simulation?
I mean, mostly like how these villagers are moving around, how they're being born, how they're dying, things like this. And these villages each are represented by like a grain of sand. I mean, grain of sound rather than sand. Sand would be okay. But so it's kind of some form of granular synthesis, but mapped directly onto this village simulation. So that was the kind of the background to the, because this is kind of mostly digital, and then some filters and analog kind of paths which can be influenced by my hands also. There's also like a brain, these daggers which can also be placed in the earth, pick up like tiny voltages, input this into the village simulation. They can also be placed on the head like this for brainwave interaction. But what I was kind of like somehow, I don't know, this is kind of quite an old instrument, like maybe 6 or 7 years since I designed it, and the kind of the village simulation side of it kind of fades into the background for me. Like, I'm not so concerned with this, but what I found kind of interesting, which I will try to demonstrate now, successfully or unsuccessfully, what I find interesting with this is that because it's kind of a very non-transparent interface, like, I mean, I know what these pads are relating to, but it's kind of very easy like to forget what is happening. So it just becomes this kind of chance, how to say, like encounter with this device. So I started to think of, I don't know, what I was interested in doing was like finding ways of playing or performing with it, sometimes with my voice only, and using it as some kind of like divination apparatus. So rather than me trying to guide this object, like it would kind of guide me in a certain direction, I would respond to this and see where this was going. So what I'll try now is to see how this might work in this situation, and where this might guide us for the moment, or for the rest of the presentation stroke performance. So as you can hear, my voice is going in to the device, but there's not much happening in terms of, like, the code is just, how to say, like, I haven't put my fingers into the code yet, or my skin, or my forehead, or earth, or anything like this. So I'll start. Yeah, I'm not really sure what I was trying to.
Can we try the forehead?
Yeah. With your forehead or?
Yeah, I might need to do this.
It seems quite silent now. But if you mean.
I will think about something.
Again. What were you thinking?
My childhood. It wasn't that. It wasn't like that actually. Thanks.
Thank you. So now I'm going to return to the story of like the development of the modules and trying to think. So the next module which I was working on was this one. Well, there are two versions here. This one here, which is called Gamma. So I was kind of at the same time, this kind of came out of some work that I was doing relating to how one could gain like a physical experience of radioactive phenomena. So I was working with another artist, Eric Berger, and we were making workshops primarily in Finland, partly connected to the building of a nuclear power station, the third one in Finland, which was somehow like a kind of activist project. So working with activists about how to gain a better knowledge of what is exactly involved in nuclear power and so on. And partly because there's somehow quite interesting natural radioactive deposits in Finland. Thank you. So we were conducting workshops which showed people how to build very simple Geiger counters, cloud chambers, things like this to visualize and make audible, thank you, radioactive phenomena. And out of this experience, I decided to produce this gamma module, which is relying on the fact that the decay of radioactive minerals, such as this one from South Germany, the decay is completely random. Like, we know how much to expect in terms of decay events, so there's kind of like the transition or the transformation of certain radioactive isotopes from one to other, which takes, in some cases, billions of years, in some cases, microseconds, like all these different timescales involved in something which might start off millions of years ago, billions of years ago as uranium-234, which then transitions into all kinds of other minerals, emitting particles, rays, whatever as it goes. So although we can kind of say like, okay, this will produce like, let's say, well, we can detect maybe 300 or 400 emission or particle emissions per second from this rock. We don't know what the length of time is between each one, and this is completely random. So it means that we can use this this mineral, which is very safe, as a way of kind of extracting randomness from the environment and then putting it into kind of electronic instruments. So this is basically like a randomness, let's say, generator. So what I'll do is return to the oscillator stroke filter, and I can kind of select what the range of that randomness is. So at the moment and I can set the speed of that randomness, which is basically like dividing down the particle emissions, more or less. So here on this module is embedded a tiny piece of uranium-containing mineral, which is quite strong, but it's kind of more or less, encapsulated. Because the main risk with working with any of these minerals is, in ingesting them. Because more or less what is happening is that the alpha particles from these minerals are they're the most powerful, but they don't penetrate the skin. But obviously if you ingest these minerals, there is nothing which is really in the way. There's no skin. Well, depends. So through either breathing in particles, eating dust from these things, so this is kind of perfectly safe because it's encapsulated. And I don't know, there's kind of long stories of what I had to do to kind of make this possible. So also kind of calculating what the worst case scenario would be, which would be more or less if you put this next to your head for an extended period of time, and more or less for this to cause any damage, you would have to have this next to your head for 20 years or something like this on a daily basis, 24 hours a day. So it's at these kind of distances, because it's also dropping off by distance, kind of exponentially. So this is the randomness, which is just randomness as control voltage, which is generated by this. And then we also, so this is kind of just random. And then what we can also listen to is the so these are the pulses coming from the mineral, which also we can divide down, so they can be used as kind of like a random gate signal, depending on how fast you want things to be happening. And then the other one, which I only use myself for performance, is the same module, but without the radioactive rock. So then what we're hearing now is background radiation, which can come from rocks within the building, certain gases which might accumulate in the building, cosmic rays, things like this. But we don't know where it's coming from, but this is kind of, we can't actually extract any randomness successfully from this, because it would take maybe 1 hour to get one kind of random piece of information from this, because it's very, very slow. But using this, we can see this is kind of I was about to say it's not as active as this, but it's also about where in this stone, within the stone will be some vein or some piece of uranium containing mineral, and it's very much about the distance. So it's more or less from this kind of distance, there's hardly any change in so this I would use in performance to kind of trigger different events, or and most recently I used for this kind of performance installation I was doing last week in Invalidovna. I was using this with the smoke generating module, so kind of timing releases of smoke with kind of radioactive activity in the space. Okay. And so are there any questions so far?
What kind of sensor are in the modules? What kind?
In the
yeah.
So this one has a Geiger tube. So this kind of where you see this long gold-colored tube. So this is the main sensor, which most of the kind of electronics on the module generate a stable high voltage. For this tube, within this tube is some kind of gas, and basically what happens is the radioactive particles pass through this gas and kind of pull the electrons from the high voltage to the central line, which is generating like this one pulse, which then we kind of stretch, amplify, measure. But basically, like the Geiger tube is the sensor. Like there's nothing really else in there. And this is kind of I don't know. I was also interested kind of quite a lot in like the kind of the history and the culture of kind of nuclear phenomena, let's say, or radioactive phenomena or physics. And what was kind of interesting is like that these tubes, like 90%, I mean, they're Russian made, but they come from Ukraine, mostly through eBay, always through eBay. And you see sellers and they'll really be like, you have a picture of one tube, which is not so expensive, and then just like a picture of like a box like this size, full of these tubes, which kind of made me think kind of like how, you know, how many tubes were manufactured, and then the next thing that you start thinking is why were so many tubes manufactured? So it was kind of interesting that it was kind of part of like a Cold War kind of history, and also the history of uranium mining, which I was kind of, well, still am studying or making field trips to, which is where this is collected from South Germany. So it's kind of like all of this somehow kind of got channeled into the single module, which then proved to be more or less not very, but too difficult to kind of manufacture in any quantities, because it meant testing lots of Geiger tubes, getting a hold of lots of Geiger tubes, making sure everything's really stable for long periods of time, and also the packaging of the uranium-containing mineral was completely painful to do, and also just like maintaining like so many counts per second to get so much randomness, so it has to be really, really strong source, but you don't really want to handle it without proper kind of test equipment and so on. So it was kind of, that's why I kind of slowly phased out the Geiger production in favour of the what I call the worm, or the earthworm, which was kind of like a, where's this cable? Here. Which was a kind of complete departure, in a way, from this kind of more, so it's kind of like also jumping back into kind of more code-based work, and some, I don't know, kind of like the history was kind of quite, not strange, but somehow, I don't know, I was kind of became very interested in how I could simulate the voice of a crow. For various reasons. So, I mean, one reason was that around the studio in Berlin, where I worked, there were, like in the autumn, you have like hundreds and hundreds of crows like massing in the sky and the trees. And the sound of these, like this mass crows is so incredible for me. And somehow I became interested in, like, I don't know, I started reading more about how birds produce sound and how kind of non-transparent this is and how complicated, and how birds are somehow also able to mimic other sounds like mobile telephones or human voices, but with completely different kind of vocal producing apparatus to mobile phones or humans, I guess, if that makes sense. So I was kind of interested in how, like literally what was the physics of crow voice production, which is simpler in some ways than other birds, and how you could simulate that in code. So basically what happened is I kind of embarked on this exploration with somebody else that was more, let's say, physics and mathematics based than me. So she was kind of basically producing, like, well, not producing, but coming up with these differential equations that then we would try to write code for, sometimes successfully, sometimes less successfully, and you would be able to do things like manipulate how long the crow's beat would be, or its trachea, or something like this. So it was kind of, there were some interesting sounds which came out of this, but it was really, really hard for me to understand how this was working in a way, because I would just lose sight of exactly what a differential equation was, and then have to remind myself, and this would go on for like weeks and weeks and weeks. And at the same time I started exploring like speech synthesis in general, like human speech synthesis, the history of speech synthesis, what different codes and algorithms there are for this. So that kind of came in on the side, and then the whole thing just like grew into this kind of enormous project, which included like vocoder, crow voice simulation, different algorithms from different chips from the 80s for voice production. And what I decided to do was more or less, in the short story, to kind of cut the crow and vocoder stuff, because it was too much to put into one module, and just to stick with human speech simulation under various algorithms. And the result is this, what I call the worm, because I was also interested in like at the end of the crow voice thing to imagine what could be produced by a worm of varying lengths if it could produce a voice. And somehow, I don't know, I kind of got to this kind of mindset or some idea that somehow all voices are kind of in some ways technologically produced, so there's not that much difference between that we all are in a way like speech synthesizers. So I was kind of interested in this idea. So then I don't demonstrate so much because I think. So you have like. So there's kind of 64 different modes around more or less like 6 different speech synthesis algorithms, and lots of data was extracted from like speak and spell and things like this, some by other people, some by me. And then there are various manipulations of different parameters of those speech. And then there's a mode which is called compost, which is basically like buffering like the last section. And obviously you have like speed, pitch, different things like this, and this is all under like, and then some like text to speech, which is kind of quite hard to control, but each parameter is under control, so and there's also a trigger, so it's triggering the start of each speech thing with the radioactive thing, mineral. And so the other side of this, which was the vocoder and crow voice side of things, is still kind of in development, but not so much. Because I just find it quite difficult, and I use some aspects of the code in performance. I'm just going to see. So this is kind of like the same module, but with different code running on it. And I'm just trying to think if that will produce anything. Will that produce? doing? Is that doing anything whatsoever? Yeah, let's start with this. So this, which I kind of use rarely in performances, like I said, is more or less tweaking like some of the parameters of the speech synthesis were a bit more extreme. And then I think in this setting, is to basically to take certain parameters from a crow's voice, which are then extracted, and then these are like reprocessing my own voice. So it's kind of using kind of quite an old, quite low-tech synthesis algorithm called LPC, linear predictive coding from 70s and 80s, to kind of mix those two things together. So what was interesting is also how you can kind of, like as well as vocoder, which is able to kind of cross-combine different voices, how you can also use other techniques to kind of merge my own voice with like a crow voice or a worm voice to manipulate the length of my own throat or something like this. So what I'll come to, so again, like after, and this is also like in between kind of other performance projects and so on. So what after the earthworm, which is maybe more code based, I started kind of returning to more physical more physical or material investigations. And maybe 2 years ago, I was invited to take part in a festival on an archaeological site in ancient Greece. So it's kind of like a large like sound art festival in this kind of ancient Greek site. I became interested in temperature change and in smoke production, and how within this whole kind of like ancient Greek world, like what the purposes of kind of like sacrifice, which involved producing large amounts of smoke or burning things, these were somehow, I don't know, I was interested in the idea that these were somehow feeding demons or something like this, or invoking demons or invoking dreams. And there were various arguments like against sacrifice, that it was this way of nourishing demons, and I started thinking about how this somehow could relate to more kind of modern concerns with smog and pollution and so on, how these could also be some kind of like technological nourishment for demons. So then I kind of processed or put that research into this module called Breath, which then I paired with this module called Light or Licht in German, because somehow, so the first one was like, how can I produce smoke and how can this be controlled? And then at the same time, like how can I then like sonify the movements and the production of smoke using light? So what I'll do is to show, first of all, the smoke. And for this, I need to use extra power supply, because it's using
This here?
Yeah, it's okay. Thanks. Because it's using quite a lot of power to produce smoke, or heat and then smoke. So this I plug in here, and then I have two controls. So this is the signal which will control the smoke, so this is like control voltage. Now everyone's interested. And this is kind of like offset, which is just like adding. So if I kind of put the offset right up, we should see, well, I can feel it getting warm, and if the room, I mean, if it wasn't so bright, you would see like it starts to glow red. And so if I, which do you, so it's a sage. And then the other knob is for kind of amplification of the control signal, which I already have going in, which is just like a simple on-off from this, which has been modified. So I'll add some of the offset. So slow this down. problem is once it starts burning, it's kind of... So just slow this down. And then this is working with, which is quite hard to do in this. So normally how I would sonify, let's just take this off. A moment. So just to give an example of the light side of things. So that's just from, I mean, you could use like a candle or something like this. And, thank you. And then using this also. So this is just the laser hitting the light sensor. I'm just trying to find like a stable position. Wait, it's not so easy. So let's just have the thing is, it's more like the vibration of my hand than you're hearing the... Wait. So I'll just... But kind of more or less illustrates the... I mean, normally I would use like something that's holding the laser, but it becomes kind of difficult to tune everything. And these two I still have available, more or less, of the only two. And then I'll finish with, so this last module that I'll present, I'll just take out this, is something I've been working on for a long time, which is called All the Colours of the Noise, which is kind of after one giallo film, All the Colours of the Dark or Night. And it's more or less, I wanted, again, it's kind of like a move from the kind of more material based to something which in some ways, yeah, it's more or less like code based, but also using like two analog noise sources and two kind of analog filters, but then the rest is more or less like lots of very fast running shift registers, pulse. So it's kind of more or less the idea is to have one single module which covers like everything which one could want to do with noise without necessarily having to use any other modulation source. So kind of completely self-contained, and also to have somehow the design is kind of, I mean, this also isn't finished, more or less. Like it's at the stage now where I'm just like playing around with it for months and months and months until I'm kind of happy with the code, and then, if necessary, going back and changing or tweaking a few things. But the design is more or less based on one alchemical scroll from the 16th century that was repeated many, many times without anyone knowing who the authors were. And the scroll is kind of huge, like meters long, with various kind of alchemical operations described in terms of blood and dragons and drops and drips. So this somehow was kind of like the inspiration for like the kind of the pulse side of things, different frequencies of noise and so on. And so I was kind of like taking inspiration from the scroll and more or less dividing the module into 4 sections which kind of mirror or repeat each other. And the first one on the left is like the low frequency side of things. On the right there's the high frequency, or in this case the moon and the sun on this side. And then the same thing upwards and downwards, so it's kind of like also something which you kind of patch and repatch without really paying attention to what it means, and nothing is, like in all modules, like nothing is ever labeled for this way of, so it sounds something like, so this is like the low frequency side, which goes down to kind of like sub bass. And then the patch is just kind of like internal, like nothing else, going in. And then on the high frequency side, we have something like, and then without. So that's without any kind of patching, so it's more or less just like noise sources with two filters. And then we can access like the shift register. And then there's just more or less like 2 sets of different modes, like 64 for each section, and then the rest is more or less like analog controls over this, and then each thing is patchable. But this is still a way off, maybe. but somehow it's just a way, like a question for me of like creating a module which was more, I guess, more about the sound than any other material kind of property or process, and somehow like trying to encapsulate what I couldn't find anywhere else and wanted to do in one module. Yeah. That's more I'll say.
I think there is still time for any questions.
Yeah.
I believe.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, if Deus, whatever this is,
Yeah.
like, if you simulate like people in a medieval village,
Yeah.
is it possible that they all die?
Yeah, it is.
And what happened?
Then we just like start them up again. I mean, sometimes you have to repower it, you know. So it's just like when you reboot the whole thing, then everything starts from scratch. So it like has the most kind of basic state, and then it gets more and more kind of like there are more. I don't know. Like I don't know. It's hard because it was like a long time since I wrote the code, and like some of the parts of the code were kind of abstract, and some were kind of quite practical. But it's more or less like each person or each villager, I don't want to say person, each villager has kind of like a process like attached to them, so they kind of run around doing that thing, and they're also subjected to kind of other processes kind of from above or from here, let's say. And you can kind of control more or less what they're doing, but they kind of just run and do what they're doing in a sense. Like they're kind of like little processes or little kind of creatures in there that are also like, a lot of what they're doing is kind of inspired by computer code and things like this. So you can also think of them as like people or as computers living in this medieval world.
So the source for creating this instrument environment
Yeah.
of the medieval village was probably some historical literature with some data.
Not
You were
not so much.
It's just an idea.
Yeah, it's an idea, but I mean, most of what I put into this was coming from like a lot of investigation of how you simulate things like plague. Like that's what it became kind of interesting. It's like you can literally like read so many scientific papers on like, okay, this is like the most simple algorithm, which is, I mean, one of the most simple is the one which I named this module after, which is SIR, sustainable, infected, recovered. So it kind of covers like 3 states, which doesn't include birth or death. And more or less you just kind of like, and when you run this, it's not super exciting because it just follows like a kind of, you know, quite simple kind of wave. But this is more or less what I use in here. But I was kind of interested in like what happens when you put conflicting kind of algorithms into the same space and how they kind of interfere with each other, which is kind of what happened with this one. So it's also like how in this module you kind of get patterns which repeat and repeat and repeat, and then sometimes they might slowly change. So it's kind of used more or less as kind of like a kind of pattern generator based on those. And I was thinking of reviving it, but I'm not so sure at the moment. Given kind of new data and how this could be linked to like, I don't know, contagion in different countries. But then it becomes more, I don't know, I like to keep it kind of quite, kind of untied from anything. And also there's kind of like, I don't know, like one thing which I was kind of interested in both modules is like how to find ways of writing code which are not, I don't know how to describe it. So more or less like in this one, I took like the Edgar Allan Poe story, The Mask of the Red Death, where, I don't know whether, also a nice film, Roger Corman, I think. So it's more or less this kind of like, this prince who's kind of like walled himself off in this castle, and all the poor, what do you call them? People, but the peasants are kind of out there like dying from the plague, and he's somehow like mocking them by walling himself off with his guests, having this huge feast. And then within the feast is kind of like this red masked figure who is the plague, but then in the story there's kind of like a progression through all these different coloured rooms until finally they get to the red room and then everybody dies. So I was interested in how you could like literally take that story and like how can I write a piece of software which follows that story or is that story, or I don't know, not just kind of like, this was kind of quite difficult, but like basically how you can translate fiction into kind of like software that kind of does something when you have other things. So both of these were kind of like, how can you translate like a fictional world into code and it still does or sounds like something more or less.
Can I ask, like all these modules, they have a like very specific story that
Yeah.
you always tell the story, but
Yeah.
then they are in a system, and
Yeah.
with the patch you kind of cross-link the
Yeah,
stories.
yeah.
Do you have like particular idea of a narrative that you're building, or are you rather creating an ecosystem when you patch up the system?
Yeah, that's a good question.
No,
It's a nice question. I mean, also, something which I've never, because this is actually the first, like, from my, like, there are people that have like a full, you know, there are people that probably have more modules than I have of these. But this is actually the first time where I've put these together in one case, because normally, like this case would be half things which I need to control smoke that are kind of doing more than this, in terms of kind of like offsets and things like this, so controlling like 5 or 6 different heat sources, fans and so on, so it tends to be like a lot of control stuff. So this first time I put everything together, and I don't really think it's an ecosystem, because certain things don't make sense within that ecosystem. Like, I don't know, like the voice for me always jumps out as being something which is something else, which I struggle with a bit, even though I really like it, but it's something which is kind of like, I don't quite know what it is. Whereas I think the other things maybe do form an ecosystem, but more this kind of, or a story rather, that kind of crosses this like, between this material world of like earth and radioactive phenomena and this kind of, yeah, I mean I guess the story is that, of like, what do these things have to do with each other? Like the earth and code which is simulating a human voice, like what is that connection? I guess it's the, yeah, it's not so much a narrative but a question that is a narrative. If that answers anything, I don't know. Yeah, because it was kind of like with the voice thing, it was like that kind of started with a very physical process, like what, you know, like literally like reading books on like, which, I mean, very kind of beautiful books where literally they have kind of like mirrored images of the, what do I call it, like the larynx moving, so you can like time this and photograph this and film this and extract information from this about what are the physical processes behind speech or behind bird speech. So that was kind of the starting point, was something very physical, but then it went into this kind of code world, which is just like literally, it's like, I don't know, also became some kind of, like this is maybe straying from your question, but became some kind of obsession of really like, okay, I have like the, or I can download like the Italian vocabulary from a certain speak and spell, but nobody actually knows where that information is, so it's really like writing code that looks at data and tries to figure out, is there any speech data here at all? Not like speech, like, but really like the super encoded, super short filter parameters of speech for this kind of one Italian thing. So it's kind of like, it became this real obsession of like how to find in these numbers something which is like a voice, which is from somebody real that lived 30 or 40 years ago. Is that right? Yeah. Which is somehow quite interesting in a way. I don't know, a lot of like the stories and the culture of like speech synthesis I started to get really interested in as well. So for example, like what sounds kind of like artificial speech, like all the speak and spell stuff or whatever is in here, is people speaking. I mean, their job would be to speak, analyze, take out the values, put it into the chip. And then there are also lots of funny stories about basically how some people doing this job didn't have time to do it really, so they would just kind of invent, like, oh, it looks like that's the right kind of data for this word or something like this, and then you have like these glitches which just are there for the next like 30 years where it's just like, it doesn't really sound like that word because somebody was just too lazy to actually speak it and just like, okay, we can just like take this other word and modify a few like parameters, and it's kind of, so I found that kind of, yeah, I mean for me that's a fascinating thing of like literally how like these numbers encode something which was kind of material and human in a way.
Since you're working with the elemental and the electrical, do you notice any changes when there's like celestial events in the way that your machine harmonizes or
I mean
reacts in some way?
this I haven't really, I mean I started looking at this more recently. I'm not so sure. Because I think also maybe these, like, or these influences or these events are on like kind of different timescales that are hard to kind of get a grip with on something so kind of temporary or.
I guess the easiest one would be like when Mercury retrogrades, does it cause you a bunch of
Well,
electrical problems?
well.
As it's kind of known to do that.
Well.
It'd be fun to start tracking that.
I mean, I was interested, like I started looking at quite recently, there was somebody whose first name I can't remember, but her second name was Kalisko, and she was working in like, I think from 1930s and 1940s onwards, and finding basically like ways of visualizing how like planetary events linked with metals would influence like photographic exposures of mixtures which involve those metals. And they're really incredible books and research which she did, which is really like, but so, what's the word I'm looking for? Like a super scientific approach of really like, for like 365 days, every day making the same exposure with the same chemistry, so working with silver nitrate and looking at like lunar eclipses and things like this. And it did appear that there were certain kind of influences and certain results, so that it's something which could be translated, but it was kind of like also like the exposure time was, you know, like a day, like 24 hours, whereas like if I'm just working with the modular setup for like, like I said, like 1 hour or 2 hours, then it's kind of like, I mean, you could time those 2 hours that would be significant, but yeah, it would take, but it's definitely an interesting avenue, I think. And I was also looking into like replicating some of these experiments with silver nitrate and maybe, I don't know, other metals.
Yes, about the Geiger Tube
Yeah.
module, you had some control that controlled the density of the
Yeah.
signals detected.
Yeah.
So that's some sort of just a comparator on the randomness, or is that like actual sensitivity of which particles are detected?
No.
Or can you just explain that?
So basically, like what I do is like try and capture as many events as quickly as possible. So that's kind of like, that's unchanging. Like basically like the uranium mineral is like as close as possible to the tube, which makes the maximum number of events, and that's what you hear. Like the pulses. So the pulses then go into like microcontroller, and this is where I then can like subdivide that down to get slower series of events.
Right, so it's like a divider.
Yeah.
Do you have
Yeah, so
problems
just-
traveling with the uranium?
No. Nobody knows it's that. So, and it's kind of like it's a safe. And it's also like, I mean, I can talk forever about these things, but like, so for example, like, I mean, some of these minerals are like, for this in particular, I order from mineral suppliers, and it's just kind of like, it's just a funny, how to say, I don't know, interesting, but it's just a funny shift or something like this. So it's kind of like, so I can order like really strong uranium-containing minerals from, but basically the people selling it are like stone collectors or like mineral suppliers, and that's not their primary interest in that mineral. Like they're interested in like if there's any fluorescence or any other kind of parts of that. But just the way that they ship it is really like beyond. Like the first time it happened, I was really amazed, because it's kind of like if you order like some kind of radioactive source which is for that source, it's kind of like chances are you can't order it. And I tried ordering from the United States, like cesium-137, which is good for like calibration of certain equipment. You can't order it. If you do order it, well, you can order it, so it's a contradiction. But anyway, basically you need like a paid courier with a license to pick this up from the airport, bring it to you, even though it's quite a weak source. But then these mineral suppliers basically take the rocks, uranium-containing minerals, wrap them in toilet roll, put them in a box, and ship it to you. So literally, you kind of like open this box, and it's just like fragments of this stuff in this toilet roll, and you're really like, you know, and it's not even weak. I don't know. It always just amazed me, kind of like, if you're like breathing in this dust, it's completely a disaster. So I think, I don't know, either they just don't, I mean, they don't measure it, they don't care, they don't, I don't know. But it is kind of quite hard to get hold of, like, minerals of like a known concentration, or, yeah, let's say. And sometimes on eBay you'll be like watching some auctions from people maybe in Romania, in Ukraine, and then suddenly they're just like, all of them vanish, like, you know, completely, because they're kind of quite strong sources.
Any more questions, anyone?
And I have a radioactive, yeah, the highlight, or one of the highlights of my investigations here. So we went to Yakimov a few weeks ago, so which is like on the border to Germany, which was like historic kind of silver mining and then uranium mining area, which now has like radioactive spa water. So I have a bottle of radioactive water, not here, which I was really excited about because it's the first time ever. Like literally, you can put like a bottle of water here and see, like, you know, like it's this kind of powerful. And yeah, you can bathe in this water, and it's supposed to be quite healthy.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, this is like the whole kind of, they have like a whole spa industry there.
Okay.
And the guy who like took us down the mine was like explaining, he was very funny. It was more or less like, yeah, it's good because it kind of like wakes up the cells, like the alpha particles just like kind of, no, it's like, it's really great, the expression you use, kind of like, it's like waking up the lazy cells, like, yeah, exactly. Like, I mean, it does, it's like a jolt of energy, but it's just like, which I thought was really nice, it was just like the lazy cells. Like, but we kind of carry on more with this investigation of like radon water as well.
So what modules do you produce at this moment? So a lot of them are actually discontinued, or like,
Yeah, like all, because they're all in small editions, so the only ones which are still produced are the breath and the light, because they're kind of quite recent, and then there was lots of problems with shipping. And then this one is kind of still in progress, all the colours of the noise, but will be like eventually released.
Are there any other models on your to-do list?
That's a difficult question. There are, which I'm working on at the moment. So, like one thing which I'm lots of different directions, but one thing which I'm kind of interested, or which, not, I don't know, interested is the wrong word, but which is always kind of like, how to say it, yeah, basically like how to put that kind of touch interface, like not using the same touch interface, but having some kind of like I would like to have a case which has no knobs at all, and it's all just like touch based. So I kind of work on this, which is kind of quite, I don't know, not super complicated, but it's just more about like how this thing looks and how this thing is working and what is under control of touch and how to connect different signals without noise too much and things like this. And then I work on, because at the same time as producing or developing this one, I kind of like branched off in two different directions. So one will be kind of like a different filter to this, which includes some chaotic elements, and then the other would be a kind of more advanced like shift register thing with kind of lots of overlapping and things like this. But they're still kind of in progress. I mean, the filter thing is kind of close, and yeah, but I'm kind of, the touch thing was kind of more like a personal obsession, and then whether that would find its way into an actual module that's produced, or whether it's just like some large interface or something like this, I don't know. But like a lot of like the early instruments I made were all touch based. because I was interested in this idea of just like how signals go. Like it's not necessarily about using touch as like instead of a knob or as an interface, but really how signals combine and go through the skin or through earth as well. So, yeah.
Okay, I guess no one else is having a question. I would like to thank Martin for talking
Thank you.
today. And if anyone is interested in buying